Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to share with you some thoughts and comments that I have with respect to a very fascinating film that is from the fascinating filmmaker from Japan, whose name is Takeshi Kitano. Today, the film I want to focus our attention on is that which was first released in 1995. And in Japanese, it is known as Minna Yatteru ka. In English, it is often referred to as Getting Any. This is the Japanese Blu-ray that I have of this film, Minna Yatteru ka, or Getting Any. And it is, as I say, a fascinating film in the context of the filmography of Takeshi Kitano. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I guess maybe the first place to go would be to make the point that in some of the marketing materials for this film, for example, the trailers for this film, in some of those materials, this film is described as being the fifth film directed by Takeshi Kitano, and at the same time, the first film directed by Beat Takeshi. I think that is a very apt and appropriate way to describe this film. Now, the reason why I feel that way is due to the notion of Takeshi Kitano and Beat Takeshi. So, as we know, Takeshi Kitano and Beat Takeshi are one and the same person. They are the same human being. Takeshi Kitano is a film maker, artist, director, editor. He is a writer. He's a director, of course, but he is also a comedian, an entertainer, a TV personality, and the like. And he remains very popular in Japan to this very day. Incredibly popular, and he appears regularly on broadcast television. So he is known, or one of the reasons why he became famous is because of his success as a comedian. Now, for those of you who don't know the comedy or the brand of comedy of Beat Takeshi, to describe it in very general terms, it is a kind of comedy that has a lot of things about it. There are aspects of physical comedy or slapstick comedy, slapstick humor. There are visual gags, sight gags. There are a lot of things to do with sketch comedy. There's also the aspect of comedy duos, or manzai, as it's known in Japanese. There's also lowbrow humor, oftentimes referred to maybe as potty humor. There are some sexual innuendo jokes, and there are clever uses of language, the Japanese language, not only in the telling of the jokes, but also in sort of double entendre wordplay and things of that nature. And so that's what we get, I think, when we talk about the comedy of Beat Takeshi and what made him very famous and what makes him still very famous and very popular. And so with that, we have the Beat Takeshi persona. Then we have the Takeshi Kitano persona, which is, of course, the filmmaker persona that we have begun to know and get associated with in the films that we have been exploring thus far, starting all the way back a few years with the film Violent Cop, and then Boiling Point, and then The Scene at Sea, and then Sonatine. And so we get these various aspects or expressions of the Takeshi Kitano persona. Whether he be an entertainer or comedian, he will be referred to as Beat Takeshi. If he is appearing as an actor or as a performer on screen, he will also be referred to as Beat Takeshi. If he's being referred to as a filmmaker or as a director or writer or an editor, he will be referred to as Takeshi Kitano. And so this is a very broad way to say that Takeshi Kitano is a very multifaceted, multi-talented superstar entertainer and filmmaker artist extraordinaire. Now, with that in mind, we also have to remember, therefore, that we will get so many different types of stories, so many different types of concerns, and so many different genres of entertainment from Takeshi Kitano. In other words, he might be interested in a crime drama, a police procedural drama like we saw in some earlier films. Maybe he might be interested in a Yakuza film, a gangster film, which we've seen in past examples. Or he might be interested in a human drama romance tale that we saw in one of his past works. But this is to say that there is still that aspect of Beat Takeshi that, at least in terms of his films, has not necessarily been the direct focus. We have seen aspects of comedy in his films up to now that I would say are very much part of the spirit of the Beat Takeshi persona, but it's never been, I would suggest, on full display, front and center, if you will, until now. This film, Minna Yatteru Ka, is wall-to-wall Beat Takeshi. This is a Beat Takeshi feel. This is the spirit of the comedy of Beat Takeshi. We get the slapstick humor, we get the visual sight gags, we get the clever uses of language and double entendre, we get the lowbrow humor, we get the sexual innuendo and the like, and we get a lot of it. It's wall-to-wall Beat Takeshi comedy zaniness. And so on that level, in that way, in that perspective, this film could be said to be radically different from the types of films that we have seen from Takeshi Kitano up to now. And if you feel that way upon watching this, then I think that's a very reasonable assessment to have. So on the one hand, I can see that some might look at this as being a radical departure from the ordinary or the otherwise the usual Takeshi Kitano films that we have seen thus far, because it's has its so intense focus on the Beat Takeshi comedy brand, if you will. However, I would suggest that this film is, in fact, very much consistent with the filmography of Takeshi Kitano. And in fact, I would say also it is a very significant film in the context of Kitano's filmography. So what do I mean by this? So first of all, it is very significant because, as I say, this is the reflection of the Beat Takeshi personality that I think is very popular among, say, Japanese people. And for a lot of people who aren't necessarily, for a lot of people who are familiar with Beat Takeshi through his comedy, this kind of Beat Takeshi persona is something that they will probably be very closely associated with. For example, my parents, when they first saw this film, they felt that this was the Beat Takeshi they knew, and this is the type of stuff that they grew to know when they came to Beat Takeshi. So much so that they felt that this was for them, at least upon first viewing, closer to the spirit of what they understood to be Beat Takeshi than the prior films that he had directed, like Sonatine or Violent Cop, etc. Of course, later on, they came to realize that that aspect of the Takeshi Kitano persona is also part of Takeshi Kitano. But for purposes of an initial watch, they felt that this was closer in spirit to what they knew Beat Takeshi was. So, and I think that is, it's an anecdotal little story there, but I think that could be something that could be said to be a similar type of reaction for a number of other people. And so in that sense, I think we are getting a very important reflection of Beat Takeshi here in the type of humor stories that he is presenting to us, right? And they are very lowbrow, and they might seem to be somewhat crude, but they're also very, I think a lot of them are very funny, and they have clever bits to them, and they seem to make fun of themselves. They don't take themselves too seriously. And so therefore, I think it's a lot of fun. And looking at it that way, it can be a lot of fun. I mean, it's a funny plot, right? It's about a young man who is trying to, or he has this notion, right, of he wants to have sex with a woman. And he gets this notion that in order to be able to do so, he needs to have a car. And so the film is essentially covering his exploits in trying to get a car and all the things he has to do, all the little configurations and planning and pre-planning and what he has to do to achieve X. In order to achieve Y, he has to go through A, B, C, and all these permutations lead to these various situations that present, as I say, this entire mix of broad slapstick humor, sight gags, visual gags, sexual innuendo, lowbrow comedy, and double entendre, language comedy, and the like. So therein lies, I think, the essence of this film. And as I was indicating earlier, right, it's a film that doesn't take itself seriously, which I think is part of the joy of the film. It has a lovely freshness about it, because it just goes from sketch to sketch to sketch, and it has this this light, almost zany sense of sort of the beautifully applied nonsensical absurdist comedy, which is great, especially in the hands of Beat Takeshi. And of course, you can tell that he's having such a great time, and you can almost sense, right? He's the director, and he's probably sitting behind the camera as these shots are being filmed, and you can almost sense Takeshi Kitano, or Beat Takeshi, sitting behind the camera, and he's just laughing out loud as he's watching these shots being filmed, and this story being created. So there is this lovely sense of the zany and the wild and the sort of really absurd and quite creative. So this is, as I say, Beat Takeshi's comedy par excellence. But I would also say that this film, Minna Yatteru Ka, despite it not having, at least on the surface, a kind of similarity, if you will, with a film like, say, Sonatine, or a film like, say, Violent Cop, it is, I think, still very much consistent with the Takeshi Kitano filmography for a number of reasons. So first, we have, in the mix of this Beat Takeshi humor, we always have this sense of what I would call the focus on the Japanese-ness, aspects of Japanese society and art and history that are picked up on by Takeshi Kitano. And they are turned on their heads. They are things that might be seen to be traditional, but then are made modern and fresh in the hands of Takeshi Kitano. Or they are used to illuminate parts of the plot or story or character in his films. Here in Minna Yatteru Ka, he applies all of these, what I would call, aspects of Japanese-ness in many different specific forms, in a way that turns them on their heads, right? Because he is essentially using them in this brand of comedy. So for example, he makes references to, say, past Japanese yakuza or gangster films. There are references in particular made to the very famous actor Joe Shishido. That's one example. There are many guest appearances by a number of different actors and performers many of these guest appearances, and these are also indirect or direct references to let's say to famous comedy shows or TV shows or films from the past, say in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so there are so many of these references going on in terms of homages to past Japanese entertainment. So we have comedy homage, we have cinema homage. There are references also to Kurosawa. There are also references made to police dramas, and there are also references made to also softcore erotica, V-cinema type of films, and this sort of thing. And this is also to suggest that Takeshi Kitano, as a filmmaker in this film, Minna Yatteru Ka, is making a film that is pointing the camera and pointing the comedic eye at this notion of cinema. And the absurdist stories that emerge from this, and also the absurdist comic tales that emerge behind the scenes, because there are some moments where Kitano's comic eye is pointed not just at the foreground stuff, but also the background production stuff. And so there are some interesting sketches involving filmmaking as well as the films being made. So, and this is, I think, very inherent in what Takeshi Kitano is talking about in terms of the life of an entertainer, the life of a comedian and a professional artist in Japan. And so there are a lot of these references that could be said to be, for lack of a better phrase, some kind of expression or reference to a Japaneseness about society, here about certain modes of entertainment, cinema, television, and art production in general overall. So that's one thing. The other thing, too, is that, and also I forgot to say that in these modes of homage, he's also paying homage to, for example, the monster film, what's known as kaiju. There are also homages or references to similar sorts of tokusatsu or special effects films. Famous examples in the past being, say, Ultraman and that sort of line of show or film. And so these references are made, and the film is filled to the brim with them, and it's wonderful to see. And so we have seen this type, as I say, this type of homage or reference to Japaneseness in other Takeshi Kitano films. And so the fact that we get those here in abundance like this means, at least in my view, that this film is very much sitting comfortably in the filmography of Takeshi Kitano. Another way that this kind of expression of Japaneseness emerges in this are, for example, the use of music and songs. There are many songs that can be described as being either Japanese folk songs or also classic pop ballads. Also, there's a kind of song genre in Japan called enka, and so there are a lot of enka songs that are employed as well as these classic Japanese hits. And so we get this great, almost loving feel of the nostalgic past through the use of music. And I think we see it also applied in a very funny setting, in this self-referential and modern mix of really beautifully absurdist comedy. And so we see the traditional, but it's turned on its head and it made modern by the application of the comedy and timing of Beat Takeshi or Takeshi Kitano. So there's the music landscape there. There are also images that are employed, various images of landscape, of environment, of cities, and not just cities or real life places, but also symbols that stand in for other things that are commonly referred to or commonly known in Japan. And so we get a lot of this stuff packed in, and I think a lot of these references are things that one can appreciate as part of the daily fabric of Japanese living, especially during this time, the mid-1990s. And so this is to say that this use of the everyday is also part of the Takeshi Kitano film experience. And so we have that here a lot in this film, and applied very creatively, and again in that Takeshi Kitano or Beat Takeshi way, always turned on its head and used for some kind of visual, cinematic, or comic, or all of the above effect. And so that is, I think, very important in filmography of Kitano, and thus this film is very significant. Then we have a film that is, I think, very intricate in its story. I mean, on the one hand, one could say that the story is very simple, and it's perhaps, it could be described as maybe being almost bereft of a story, because it's essentially about a young man who is trying to have sex with a woman, and he thinks that in order to achieve this goal, he has to get a car. And so therein lies, as I say, the start of the film. But from there, all these various variations on a theme or a point emerge. So it becomes this almost sequential sketch comedy type of film that has often been described as being something similar to a film like, say, Airplane, or that kind of feel, where there is a through line of a story, but the expression is in this form of these slapstick type of, or this comedy sketches that have a very loose and very broadly defined connections, if you will. In other words, they're not necessarily reliant on a strictly applied and strictly structured and rigid narrative, but there are some loose connections that can be made from sketch to sketch to sketch. But at the same time, I would argue that this film is also very much inherently complex in terms of how one scenario leads to another scenario, leads to another scenario, leads to another scenario, leads to another scenario. Sometimes we get imagining, characters imagining something, which then leads to another scenario, and then another scenario, and going back to the original scenario, and then imagining a scenario B, which will then lead to this thing, and then this thing, and this thing, but then that will end going back here, then progressing with the originally applied linear track of loosely connected sequence, as I was describing earlier, but then stopping along the way, maybe following another character, going here, making a detour, going there, and then returning, and then coming back, and then going forth. So this is my crude way to say that I would suggest that it's actually a very intricate sequence that is it's actually quite ingeniously arranged. And if we recall films like, say, the film Boiling Point, we know that Takeshi Kitano's films often rely on these seemingly simple stories, but in fact we realize that the sequence of events, where one sequence leads to another, to another, is actually quite complicated. And they rely on very little details. I mean, they rely on minute details, that's what I mean. They rely on minute details, little shifts, but they have these consequences because they lead to the next sequence. And then little shifts, but have these major consequences, potentially, that lead to these little sequences. And that's how this film, I think, is operating. Because these little details about what the character played by Duncan, he has to do in order to achieve his goal of meeting a woman. He's got to get a car. Well, how is he going to get a car? Well, he has to go to the car shop. Or how is he going to afford it? Well, he has to do this, he has to do that. And how is he going to be able to get to the stage where he can afford it? Well, he has to do this. In order to do this, he has to do this. And how is he going to come up with this? Along the way, he's imagining, oh, I wish I could be in this situation. And he imagined this. So there is a very intricately imposed structure, which is, I would argue, very reminiscent of what we have seen in past Takeshi Kitano works. And so this is, I would argue, very consistent with the world of the filmography of Takeshi Kitano. Now, with all that being said, I still understand 100% if anyone who comes to this film for the first time, knowing, say, Kitano's past works, watches this film for the first time, and is at a loss for how to compute this film, how to deal with this film. If you feel that way, that's totally okay. I think that's totally okay. And in fact, one could say too that, as I was indicating, or as I was suggesting at the start of the video, this is of course very purely 100% Beat Takeshi, I would suggest. And so it is very consistent with what we can expect from Takeshi Kitano or Beat Takeshi. At the same time, we have to remember that this is a very bold move in terms of Takeshi Kitano as a filmmaker. It's arguably a very strong departure from the films that we had seen up to now. Even a film like A Scene at the Sea, which itself might be described as being a departure from his work, I would argue is nowhere near as potentially a radical departure from his filmography as, say, this film is. And so if you feel that way, that is completely, I think, legitimate and reasonable. And in fact, I would myself buy into that kind of viewpoint of this film, in the sense that this also feels to me to be, on the one hand, an expression of the Beat Takeshi persona, but also it feels almost like Beat Takeshi and Takeshi Kitano are themselves having a dialogue, or perhaps in a battle. Who will survive? Will it be the Beat Takeshi persona or the Takeshi Kitano persona? All the way up to now, we have seen the Takeshi Kitano persona expressed in the films, and now we get this 1000% comedian Beat Takeshi role. So it's almost like every time we expect a certain type of film from Takeshi Kitano, he suddenly upends our expectations and almost wants to destroy our expectations, which I think is a mark of a very bold and exciting filmmaker indeed, right? Because after all, making a film like Sonatine, you'd expect something similar to Sonatine, but we get something very different. But at the same time, there are little hints here and there that have a certain spirit and are in keeping with the little feels of the Yakuza films that we have seen from Takeshi Kitano in films past. And so it feels different, but it feels very familiar at the same time, which is what I want to say. And because of that, because of its many-faceted approach, I would say that that in itself, in essence, makes this film wholly consistent with the filmography of Takeshi Kitano. This is the film Minna Yatteru ka, or in English, Getting Any. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I really appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.